Good morning. I want to take a moment before we begin to acknowledge the gravity of what we are discussing today. The data that has come before us, 92,000 jobs lost, contracting economic output, and a trade environment that has been deliberately destabilized through the imposition of sweeping unilateral tariffs, represents not merely a statistical footnote in our quarterly economic reports. It represents 92,000 families. It represents 92,000 individuals who woke up one morning with a livelihood and went to bed that same evening without one. It represents communities across the industrial Midwest, across the manufacturing corridors of the South, across the small business districts of our rural towns that are now facing a contraction they did not cause and did not deserve. And it is my responsibility, as someone who has spent the better part of 4 decades studying the mechanics of labor markets, monetary policy, and international trade, to explain and with clarity, with precision, and without political embellishment exactly how we arrived at this moment, what the data is telling us, and what the consequences will be if the current trajectory is not corrected with urgency and seriousness of purpose. Let me begin with the foundation. The United States economy, for all of its extraordinary resilience and structural depth, is not immune to policy induced shocks. We have seen this before. We saw it during the Smoot-Hawley era of the 1930s, when protective tariffs triggered retaliatory measures from our trading partners and deepened what might otherwise have been a manageable recession into the most catastrophic economic collapse in modern American history. We saw it in the early 2000s when steel tariffs imposed without multilateral coordination led to downstream job losses in manufacturing sectors that far exceeded any employment gains in the protected industries. And we are seeing it again now, not as a theoretical risk, not as an economist's projection drawn on a whiteboard, but as a lived reality that is registering in our payroll data, in our GDP growth revisions, in our consumer confidence indices, and in the growing anxiety of American workers who are beginning to understand that the trade war being waged in their name is, in fact, being waged against their interests. The 92,000 jobs that have been lost represent what economists refer to as a first order effect. These are the direct, immediately measurable consequences of tariff induced cost increases, supply chain disruptions, retaliatory measures from our trading partners, and the broader uncertainty that causes businesses to freeze hiring, delay capital investment, and in many cases accelerate the relocation of production to jurisdictions where input costs remain stable and trade relationships remain predictable. But I want to be very clear about something that is often lost in the public conversation around these numbers. The first order effects are not the most dangerous part. The most dangerous part is what comes next. The second and third order effects, the ripple effects that move through the broader economy like a slow moving wave, are where recessions are truly born and where recoveries are most painfully delayed. When a manufacturer in Michigan loses a contract because the Canadian buyer has shifted their sourcing to a European supplier in response to tariff escalation, that manufacturer does not simply absorb the loss in isolation. They reduce their workforce. Their employees spend less at local businesses. Those local businesses, the restaurants, the hardware stores, the childcare providers, see their revenues decline. Some of them close. The tax base of the municipality shrinks, public services are cut, schools lose funding, infrastructure maintenance is deferred, and slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, and then with sudden and devastating clarity, an entire regional economy begins to contract around a wound that was entirely self-inflicted. This is not a hypothetical scenario. This is the documented pattern of trade war-induced economic deterioration, and it is precisely what our current data is beginning to reflect. I also want to address the international dimension of this crisis with the directness it deserves, because I think the American public has not been given an honest accounting of what is happening beyond our borders and why it matters profoundly to their economic future. Canada and the European Union, two of our most significant, most reliable, and most strategically important trading partners, have not been passive recipients of American tariff policy. They have responded. They have responded with targeted retaliatory measures designed to maximize political and economic pressure on sectors of the American economy that are most vulnerable to export disruption. They have responded by accelerating trade negotiations with one another, deepening the Canada EU Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, diversifying their supply chains away from American suppliers, and signaling to the global business community that the United States is no longer a reliable rules-based trading partner. And the consequences of that signal, of that reputational damage to America's standing as a predictable and trustworthy participant in the global economic order, will outlast any individual tariff schedule by years, if not by decades. What we are witnessing in real time is a fundamental restructuring of global trade relationships, not because our partners wanted this restructuring, not because it serves their long-term interests to decouple from the world's largest economy, but because they have been left with no responsible alternative. When a nation's trade policy becomes unpredictable, when tariffs are imposed and removed and reimposed based on political calculations rather than economic principles, when the institutions and agreements that have governed international commerce for 70 years are treated as obstacles rather than as achievements, the rational response of every other participant in the global system is to reduce their dependence on that nation. And that is exactly what Canada and the European Union are doing. They are not winning because they are stronger. They are gaining ground because we are retreating, and we are retreating not out of strategic necessity, but out of a fundamental misunderstanding of how modern trade economics actually functions. The data on relative economic performance is stark, and it deserves to be stated plainly. Canada's unemployment rate has remained comparatively stable. The European Union's export volumes to non-US markets have increased. Investment flows that would historically have been directed toward American manufacturing capacity are being redirected toward Canadian industrial zones and European production facilities. The dollar, while still the world's reserve currency, has faced mounting pressure as confidence in American economic governance has eroded. And our own Federal Reserve, an institution whose independence and credibility are among the most valuable assets the American economy possesses, has been placed in an extraordinarily difficult position, forced to navigate between inflationary pressures generated by tariff-induced cost increases on one hand and recessionary pressures generated by declining employment and contracting output on the other. This is what economists call stagflation risk, and it is among the most difficult macroeconomic environments any central bank can be asked to manage. I have spent my career believing in the capacity of sound policy to produce good outcomes, to lift wages, to reduce poverty, to create the conditions under which ordinary Americans can build stable and prosperous lives. I have also spent my career understanding that unsound policy can undo decades of progress with remarkable speed. What we are seeing today is not an act of nature. It is not a global pandemic or a financial contagion that originated beyond our borders. It is a policy choice, a series of deliberate decisions made by the executive branch of the United States government. And it is producing consequences that were predicted, that were warned against, and that are now materializing in the lived experience of American workers and families. In the sections that follow, I will walk through the specific mechanisms by which these job losses have occurred, the precise nature of the competitive advantages that Canada and the European Union are now consolidating, the long-term structural damage being done to America's position in the global economy, and the policy interventions that remain available to us if we choose to act with the seriousness and the urgency that this moment demands. To understand the full scope of what is happening to the American labor market, we must move beyond the headline number of 92,000 jobs and examine the sectoral composition of those losses with the analytical rigor that the situation demands. Because the story these numbers tell is not simply a story about quantity, about how many jobs have been lost. It is a story about which jobs have been lost, where they have been lost, and why the specific pattern of displacement we are observing carries implications that extend far beyond the immediate human cost, significant as that cost undeniably is. When we disaggregate the employment data by sector, by geography, and by wage level, what we find is a picture that should concern every serious student of American economic development, regardless of their political orientation or their prior views on trade policy. Let us begin with manufacturing because it is in the manufacturing sector that the damage is most concentrated and most immediately visible. The tariffs that have been imposed on imported steel, aluminum, and a broad range of intermediate goods have done something that their architects almost certainly did not intend, or at minimum did not adequately model. They have raised input costs for American manufacturers who depend on those materials to produce finished goods. A tariff on imported steel does not simply protect American steel producers in isolation. It increases the cost of steel for every American company that uses steel as an input, for automobile manufacturers, for appliance producers, for construction equipment companies, for the defense contractors who build the weapon systems upon which our national security depends. And when those input costs rise, those manufacturers face a choice that no amount of political messaging can eliminate. They can absorb the cost increase and accept lower profit margins. They can pass the cost increase on to consumers in the form of higher prices, or they can reduce their workforce to compensate for the higher cost of production. In the current environment, where consumer price sensitivity is already elevated following several years of above-target inflation, and where profit margins in many manufacturing subsectors were already under pressure before the tariffs were imposed, the workforce reduction option has been chosen with painful frequency. The automobile sector deserves particular attention because it illustrates with unusual clarity the integrated nature of modern North American manufacturing and the degree to which the Canada-US trade relationship is not simply a relationship between two sovereign nations exchanging finished goods across a border, but rather a deeply interconnected production ecosystem in which components, subassemblies, and finished products cross the border multiple times in the course of a single manufacturing process. A modern North American automobile may have an engine block cast in Ontario, transmission components machined in Michigan, electronic control systems assembled in Mexico, and final assembly completed in Tennessee or Ohio. When tariffs are imposed on Canadian goods entering the United States or on American goods entering Canada in retaliation, the cost of that integrated production process rises at every point where a border is crossed. And because that border is crossed multiple times in the production of a single vehicle, the cumulative tariff burden is not additive, it is multiplicative. The result is a North American automotive industry that is simultaneously less competitive in global markets, more expensive for American consumers, and less capable of sustaining the employment levels that communities across the industrial heartland depend upon. Beyond manufacturing, we are seeing significant job losses in the agricultural sector. And here the story is particularly painful because American farmers, who had absolutely no role in formulating the trade policy that has brought retaliatory measures down upon them, are bearing a disproportionate share of the consequences. Canada and the European Union have both implemented targeted retaliatory tariffs on American agricultural exports, on soybeans, on pork, on dairy products, on wheat, precisely because they understand that agricultural communities in the United States carry significant political weight, and because disrupting agricultural export markets creates economic pressure that translates into political pressure in ways that are difficult for any administration to ignore indefinitely. American soybean farmers who had built their business models around the assumption of continued access to Canadian and European markets are now facing the reality of those markets being partially or fully closed to them. The downstream effects on grain elevator operators, on agricultural equipment dealers, on rural banks that hold agricultural loans are compounding the primary impact in ways that will take years to fully measure. The services sector, which receives considerably less attention in discussions of trade policy than manufacturing and agriculture, is also experiencing meaningful disruption. This is partly a consequence of the broader economic uncertainty generated by the trade conflict. Uncertainty that causes businesses to defer expansion plans, reduce discretionary spending, and delay hiring decisions across a wide range of service industries. but it is also a consequence of specific retaliatory measures targeting American service exports, which are often overlooked because they are less visible than physical goods but are no less economically significant. American financial services firms, consulting companies, technology providers, and educational institutions all compete in international markets, and all are subject to the reputational and regulatory pressures that flow from a deteriorating trade relationship. When Canada or the European Union signals to its business community that American service providers are less reliable partners than they once were, the consequence is not an immediate, easily measurable tariff. It is a gradual erosion of market position that shows up in revenue figures and employment data over a period of months and years rather than days and weeks. I want to turn now to the geographic dimension of these job losses because it is essential to understanding both the human cost of what is happening and the political economy of why it is so difficult to reverse. The communities that are being most severely affected by the current trade disruption are not, by and large, the cosmopolitan metropolitan centers of the Northeast and West Coast. They are the mid-sized industrial cities of the Midwest and the rural communities of the agricultural heartland, places like Youngstown and Dayton and Flint and Gary, places that have already endured decades of deindustrialization and that were, in many cases, just beginning to stabilize economically before the current disruption arrived. These are communities with limited economic diversification, with thin margins of fiscal resilience, and with populations that have already experienced more than their fair share of economic dislocation. For these communities, the loss of even a few hundred manufacturing jobs is not an abstraction. It is an existential threat to the economic viability of the community itself. And this brings me to a point that I feel compelled to make with particular emphasis, because I think it is central to any honest assessment of the current situation. The narrative that has been constructed around this trade policy, the narrative that it represents a defense of American workers against unfair foreign competition, is not supported by the evidence. The workers who are losing their jobs are not losing them to Canadian or European workers who are competing unfairly. They are losing them to a policy environment that has made it more expensive to manufacture in the United States, less reliable to export from the United States, and less attractive to invest in American production capacity. The tariffs are not protecting American jobs. The tariffs are destroying American jobs. And the 92,000 figure we are discussing today is not the ceiling of that destruction. Based on the trajectory of the current data and based on the historical patterns of tariff-induced economic disruption that are well documented in the economic literature, that number will grow. The question is not whether it will grow, but by how much and how quickly, and whether the policymakers responsible for this situation will find the intellectual honesty and the political courage to change course before the damage becomes truly irreversible. Canada's economic resilience in the face of this trade conflict is not accidental, and it is not simply a matter of good fortune. It reflects deliberate policy choices made by Canadian economic policymakers who recognized early in this conflict that the United States was not going to moderate its approach through diplomatic persuasion alone, and who therefore moved with considerable speed and strategic clarity to diversify Canada's trade relationships, strengthen its domestic demand, and position Canadian exporters to capture market share in sectors where American suppliers were becoming less reliable. Prime Minister Carney's government has been particularly aggressive in pursuing trade diversification, deepening relationships with European partners, accelerating negotiations with Indo-Pacific economies, and investing in the domestic infrastructure and industrial capacity that will allow Canada to compete effectively in a world where the North American trade relationship is less predictable than it once was. The results of those investments are beginning to show in Canada's employment data and in its export volumes, and they represent a genuine competitive challenge to American economic primacy that will not simply dissolve when and if American trade policy eventually returns to a more stable footing. The European Union's position is somewhat more complex because Europe faces its own significant economic headwinds, sluggish growth in Germany, persistent structural challenges in southern member states, and the ongoing adjustment to a post pandemic, post Ukraine conflict economic environment that has reshaped European energy markets and industrial competitiveness in fundamental ways. Nevertheless, the EU has demonstrated a degree of strategic coherence in its response to American tariff policy that has surprised many observers, and that reflects the depth of institutional capacity that the European single market, for all of its internal tensions and governance challenges, continues to possess. The European Commission's retaliatory measures have been carefully calibrated to maximize pressure on the United States while minimizing collateral damage to European industries that depend on American inputs. And Europe's accelerated engagement with Canada through the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement has created a transatlantic economic corridor that is increasingly capable of functioning as a counterweight to American market power, not because Europe and Canada are adversaries of the United States, but because American policy has given them every incentive to deepen their cooperation with one another. There is a concept in macroeconomics that does not receive nearly enough attention in public discourse, and that concept is the notion of structural damage, the kind of economic harm that does not simply reverse itself when the policy that caused it is withdrawn, but that instead leaves permanent or semi-permanent scars on the productive capacity of an economy, on its institutional relationships, on its position in global supply chains, and on the confidence of the domestic and international investors and business leaders whose decisions ultimately determine the trajectory of long-term growth. We talk a great deal in policy circles and in the financial press about cyclical economic damage, the kind of contraction that follows a demand shock, or a credit tightening, or a temporary disruption in trade flows, and that can be addressed through conventional monetary and fiscal policy tools once the underlying cause of the disruption has been resolved. Structural damage is different in kind, not merely in degree, and I want to spend considerable time in this section explaining precisely why the damage being done to the American economy by the current trade policy is, to a significant and deeply troubling extent, structural rather than cyclical, and why that distinction matters enormously for any honest assessment of what the path back to full economic health will require. Let me begin with supply chains, because the disruption of global supply chains is perhaps the most immediately consequential form of structural damage that trade wars produce, and because the dynamics of supply chain restructuring are frequently misunderstood in ways that lead to dangerously optimistic assessments of how quickly normal trade relationships can be restored once political conditions change. When a company that has been sourcing components from a Canadian supplier is forced, by tariff-induced cost increases, to find an alternative supplier, whether domestic or from a third country, that transition involves real costs. The cost of identifying and qualifying a new supplier, the cost of retooling production processes to accommodate different component specifications, the cost of renegotiating contracts and restructuring logistics networks, and the cost of the inevitable quality and reliability uncertainties that accompany any new supplier relationship.